The disconnect between the current market cap and the value many investors see in this company couldn't be larger. Duolingo trades at a market cap of $5 billion, while some project that it will be the leader of a $1 trillion industry.
I was surprised to see it at such reasonable valuations, honestly. I mean, only 20 times free cash flow and growing by more than 30% a year. I mean, that's just something you rarely see.
And you still have the founder on board, which is something that we love to see. So if Duolingo comes even close to becoming the world's largest learning platform, it will be a multi-bagger. Today, we find out whether that's realistic.
Today, we will talk about a company that is dividing investors. Some argue this is the uncatchable leader of an industry that will be worth trillions of dollars one day. Others argue that it is nothing more than a language app that is actually pretty ineffective at teaching people languages. And that company is none other than Duolingo. And for anyone who's on social media, I'm sure you've seen the company's very iconic green owl before. Their social media marketing is certainly pretty special, I think you could say. But tell us, Daniel, why did you decide to pitch this company today?
Well, I want to cover this company because it's one of those situations where I just don't want to look back and realize I have missed the most obvious next big thing. I've been using the product for quite some time, although that was 2 or 3 years ago, and I actually had a streak of 300 days of studying Spanish. And spoiler, I can't speak Spanish anymore, and I actually never really could. To be fair though, that says less about Duolingo and more about my personal effort I put into Spanish practice. And I'm also playing chess from time to time, although I haven't done so in a while. And you can certainly see that in my game, if we just discussed, it's pretty terrible. I was one of those people, who started after watching The Queen's Gambit. I wish that wouldn't be the case, but unfortunately, that's how it is. And in case anyone asks, why are you talking about chess? Well, Duolingo has used the last couple of years and quarters to expand into verticals beyond just languages, and they now have courses on math, music, and chess too. And I know you have used Duolingo for quite some time too, Shawn, so I think this should be a company where we can combine our typical deep investor research with our impressions as users.
Gosh, it's a bit surreal to be sitting here talking about Duolingo today. I remember downloading it in high school to help me get ahead in German class. And then I actually would keep up with it on this on and off basis for a few years. And actually just a year or two ago, I purchased an annual subscription after only having ever used it for free. And so on the one hand, they did finally monetize me after like a decade. But then on the other hand, at the moment, I'm not using Duolingo anymore. And just for context, on free mode, basically you run out of lives or hearts with each mistake you make. And if you make too many mistakes, you're just done for the day. And so unless you watched an ad, you could gain a second chance. And eventually that just gets so frustrating. You either break your practice streak or pay up for the premium version. And I think the way to say it is they've gamified language learning. And I think that is great because it makes it fun to learn. But the downside is that it's hard to make material progress toward fluency after a certain point without having a class or an instructor to use Duolingo as a complement alongside. It's not necessarily the best standalone tool that has everything you could ever need to reach fluency. At least that's kind of how I see it.
The first thing that I immediately noticed after opening the app again was that there are significantly more ads than before. At least that's how it felt to me. And I was a bit surprised when management then mentioned that they are proud of generally not increasing the number of ads to then increase profits. According to founder and CEO Luis von Ahn, he once, a couple of quarters ago, decided to show 2 ads instead of just 1 ad after a lesson to keep the company's track record of basically beating quarterly expectations again and again, which otherwise wouldn't have worked that quarter. And according to him, he still regrets that decision. And when I dug into older interviews and earnings calls, it turns out that ad frequency was actually stable. And I found it quite interesting how basically my perception was off there. So we should never just trust our gut feeling, I guess. Although I have to say that it also depends on how quickly you finish a lesson. If the lesson takes 5 minutes, a quick ad after this isn't that bad. But if the lesson is only a minute or two, the ad gets quite annoying quickly.
I feel like I have a love-hate relationship with Duolingo, if we're being completely honest. I feel like I've really enjoyed it at times, and then other times I'm just getting annoyed with all these like pesky notifications about not breaking your streak. And at some point, it would feel like I was only doing the lessons to make the green owl happy and to stop getting notifications. And then I would just quit for a while before, at some point I would get nostalgic again about learning a language, and then I'd re-download the app and it would just, fall right back into the cycle. But, before we get into all that, how about we start by talking about the founder of Duolingo that you just alluded to, and kind of the mission behind the company. I mean, the founder seems like a really interesting character, to put it nicely. I mean, he's charismatic and confident, but also maybe a little weird too. But I think that's to be expected with tech CEOs, right? If your tech CEO is not a little weird, you're doing something wrong probably.
Well, Luis von Ahn was actually a math professor at Carnegie Mellon, and he also founded reCAPTCHA and later sold it to Google. And reCAPTCHA is this box that, pops up when you go on a website where you have to tick, I'm not a robot. And sometimes you also have to select all the squares that show, for example, traffic lights. And I actually hate those because I have a 50% fail rate with those boxes. And I mean, the point being, he seems like the real deal. And I got to be honest, that reassured me a little because when I first saw him and listened to the first earnings call and I told you about it, I didn't really know what to think. You know that I'm a fairly skeptical person, and there were just some alarm bells ringing in my head. I mean, just to give you an example, if you watch this on YouTube or Spotify, you can see a picture on screen now, and it's from Duolingo's Q3 earnings call. And what's happening here is that Luis von Ahn is explaining to an analyst how big the opportunity for Duolingo is. And to underline that, he has a button that sends money emojis up the screen. And mind you, this has been the earnings call where the stock literally plummeted 30% after the earnings release. And now you as a shareholder, you would sit there on the earnings call and the CEO would point at you and shoot cash emojis up the screen. I mean, to be fair, it's a tough balance to strike. I mean, Shawn and I listen to so many boring earnings calls. I don't want to criticize the CEO for being entertaining, but you also don't want your CEO to come across as, completely crazy. But again, Luis von Ahn is not only a character, also he's a very smart and he's a highly motivated guy. I mean, what I also like about his communication on earnings calls is that it's basically just a Q&A session. So you don't have these 30, 40, 50 minutes of prepared remarks after already looking at the numbers anyway. And one thing that I learned along the way is that it's always a good thing to have a CEO who takes more questions rather than fewer questions. And he's certainly doing that.
My favorite quirky CEO is probably Brian Chesky of Airbnb. I've said that a few times on the show. And gosh, every time I listen to him speak, he just gets me so fired up about his vision for the hospitality industry, which is not an industry that I thought I cared about. But I don't know, my takeaway when I listen to him is that great CEOs have this infectious passion for what they work on. And Brian Chesky, more than anybody, epitomizes that in my head.
To some extent, that passion is, I think, why we love founder-led companies. But getting back to Duolingo story, Luis founded the company in 2011 with his co-founder Severin Hacker, who was his PhD student and a native Swiss German speaker. So Luis himself is originally from Guatemala, so he is a native Spanish speaker. So both of them experienced firsthand how learning English basically opened up a completely new world of business opportunities for both of them. And I think that's the case for many non-English speakers, especially when they live in emerging markets. I mean, your average salary will increase significantly if you're able to speak English. And honestly, I didn't even think about that before. To me, learning languages was way more of a hobby, although this job also showed me that it's not an easy thing to, perform a job every single day in a non-native language. But yeah, Luis's idea behind Duolingo was basically to give people the opportunity to learn new languages and in turn improve their lives and their job prospects.
Well, it's funny you say that because I remember when you first started, Daniel, here at the Investors Podcast, I think we asked you to take some language classes just to make sure your English skills were really sharp before you started hosting. And man, I don't know, it seems just totally absurd in hindsight because you're so well spoken, probably better spoken than I am. But I mean, I get why it's such a differentiator, right? I mean, English is the language of business globally, but I think it's easy to forget as an American and just take for granted that for most, learning English, especially learning about investing in English, is a skill that takes continuous practice, and enter Duolingo, right? But seriously, I want to ask you, I mean, what do you think makes Duolingo so special? It's not the first app that tried to teach new languages to its users. And I remember those, I'm probably dating myself a little bit, those Rosetta Stone TV ads from way back in the day. And for the longest time, I thought you had to pay like $200 for one of these big sets, and that was the only way you could learn a language.
Well, actually, again, Duolingo was founded in 2011, and that was at a time when mobile apps just started to gain some traction. So Duolingo was, to some extent, one of the earliest apps in the market. And in fact, when the company was founded, both Luis and his co-founder still built a website, and they thought that would be the main driver of traffic. But only a couple of months later, they realized the big numbers were actually made on the app. And yet, Duolingo's success is really not about being the first mover in that space. They have been one of the few companies that successfully integrated gamification into their app. And in part, I think that's because language learning is a product that's just made to be gamified. I mean, you have all these small lessons that you can basically break into countless tiny lessons. It's repeatable, you have fast feedback loops, and you have clear progression. And you can practice everything. I mean, vocabulary, verb forms, listening discrimination, and just word order in these 60-second bursts, basically. So you get immediate feedback. You can watch yourself getting better and better, and basically going from beginner to advanced. So I think the behavior that games are great at encouraging, which is showing up often and then repeating mostly similar tasks, is also the behavior that actually produces language skills, because memory improves through spaced repetition and retrieval practice. And many other things that you can learn are just way harder to gamify, or they don't work at all. So that's often the case when, for example, feedback is delayed or progress just isn't linear. And that's when gamification would actually work against you, because you then start optimizing the metric rather than the outcome, which in this case would be actually learning a language.
I think that's what happens when you focus more on keeping a streak alive, which I'm guilty of, than actually focusing on learning the language the most effective way. And I mean, by the way, for users not familiar with this concept of a streak that we've mentioned a few times, on Duolingo, basically, you can build a streak by doing lessons consistently day after day. And the streak then shows how many days without interruption you finished a lesson. And for a lot of people, including myself at times, it is a real bragging right to be able to say, I've practiced for 106 days in a row. How many days in a row have you practiced? Look how much XP I've earned and all that stuff. And so the thing is, it's really easy to start out and get excited about learning a language. And, maybe the first day you sign up on Duolingo, you want to spend an hour on it. But the hard thing that Duolingo has to overcome, and to their credit, I think they've done really as good of a job as you can, is getting people to invest that same amount of time each day over time, and maintaining that enthusiasm, not just over a week, but over 6 months or a year or 2 years. And I think the way for me typically would start is, I don't even know if I ever did an hour session, but maybe it was up to an hour, and then it was like a half-hour session. And then it started becoming, 15 minutes at a time, then 5 minutes at a time. And at some point, and this is when I knew that I was just, going to lose my momentum, is I would just try to do the quickest lesson you could do, like some easy word matching vocab thing. And it would take like 60 seconds just to check off my streak requirement for that day. And then in the back of my head, I'd always say, all right, tomorrow we're digging back in and we're gonna do another 20 minutes. And tomorrow would come and it just, I'm back to doing the quickest lesson possible. And then I would just be out. And so I think really recurring progression-based commitments like this to anything are really, really hard to maintain as you zoom out, unless it's required of you for school or for work. And so that's probably my biggest concern with the business, because the business is premised around getting people to do things that are hard and not always enjoyable, and getting them to be excited to do them and to pay money for it. And that's tough. And so just operationally, they've been great, I would think, but it's not like TikTok or YouTube where you're buying people's attention with the stuff they enjoy watching mindlessly. Like you're like a drug dealer that's, selling the most addictive substance in the world. Whereas Duolingo is trying to get people to eat their vegetables. Like that's kind of like the equivalent of it. And so I don't know, no matter how much you gamify it, I think there's a degree of work and learning that obviously has to occur to truly learn a language. And selling people on doing homework is just not the easiest business I could imagine in the world. So I come into our call today with some biases, but maybe you can convince me otherwise.
Well, I think your experience with Duolingo has been as close to mine as it could be. I mean, this is one of the bare arguments for Duolingo, honestly. I've just rarely come across someone who actually succeeded in studying a language using Duolingo. And most of the time, that's because, as you know, the urge to just go with Netflix over Duolingo in the long run is just hard to resist. And to be fair, though, Duolingo is so popular too, though, that almost everyone who wants to learn a language starts out using it. So naturally, you'll have many people using it who never were serious about learning a language in the first place. And it doesn't matter how good your app is. If there's no intent to actually learn a language, you won't do it, no matter how gamified it is. And I think this is the fate of many apps. The best users, they join the platform or the app early on, so then metrics skyrocket and it looks like a perfectly healthy business in the beginning, but then they tend to decline over time. In Duolingo's case, these metrics could be activity, learning progress, or conversion to paid tiers. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that we covered Match Group here on the show before. One advantage that Duolingo, for example, has is that you have these streaks and you actually want to tell people about it. You're proud that you use Duolingo. You're proud that you're paying for it. With the Match Group, for example, you had an app where most people used it, maybe even paid for it, but it's something that you would never talk to other people about. So that's an advantage where you might even pay Duolingo and feel good about having a streak going on without actually learning a language, but Duolingo will still earn money.
I think it's that it's kind of why people pay for gym memberships that they don't use. You know, it's this idea of a better version of yourself. And I think it's also funny that you bring up Netflix, because I remember Ted Sarandos, who's Netflix's co-CEO. We covered Netflix on the show recently. And he pointed out that the company is not only competing with these other streaming services or even linear TV like broadcast and cable, but with everything else that somebody could literally spend their time on. And so I guess that includes Duolingo too. So you wouldn't normally think of Netflix and Duolingo being competitors, but I guess in a way they are. And you know, you just mentioned how popular Duolingo is. So just for context, how about we zoom into the numbers a bit? I mean, how many active users are we talking about? What's the TAM? I presume that they're not as big as Netflix, but you know, they pack their own punch, I'm sure.
Not yet as big as Netflix, but Duolingo has about 50 million daily active users and more than 135 million monthly active users. So it has a massive user base, and those numbers are growing fast too. I mean, daily active users are up 36% year over year. The focus is on growing daily actives rather than monthly actives, because as you can imagine, for an app that uses streaks to keep users engaged, daily active users are much more important. And, you know, they are also more likely to stay longer and then to upgrade to paid tiers, as it has happened with you and me eventually.
In terms of monetization, I did want to ask you what the various paid tiers currently look like, because obviously I've used both the free and paid version, but now I think there are, and this is probably starting to become more of a thing around the time I stopped using the app last, is there's multiple tiers to their paid subscriptions as they've expanded into more verticals and expanded the user base.
Right now, you have the super tier, the max tier, and then what is called the super family tier. And, you know, those are the paid alternatives to the free version that we're used to. And the super membership allows you to basically have unlimited energy, which means you can learn as long as you want, but it doesn't include any of the new AI features. And that's what you get in the max or the super family tier. So besides using AI to improve its algorithms and, you know, better match lessons to learners, there have been AI features like calls with Lily, which is a Duolingo character, also calls with other Duolingo characters, that basically let you actually have a conversation in the language that you're learning. So you can speak with Lily about whatever topic you want. It's pretty similar actually to speaking with ChatGPT, and that might sound like a bear case at first, and I'm sure we will get into the AI risks, but when you're at the stage of fluency where that feature of actually having a conversation makes sense for you and you reached it through Duolingo, I think it's unlikely you will throw away a streak that at that point might be, I don't know, 1,000 days and the entire progress in the language course just to save some money on ChatGPT, basically. And, you know, that's also what the numbers would suggest. Since the feature launched, bookings for the Max tier have doubled, clearly indicating that it resonates quite well with users.
I think I did do an AI call with Lily at one point, and Lily is this, you know, it's an animated character, and I think she's got like purple hair, and she's like kind of disinterested in you, and like kind of, you know, maybe depressed. And you know, in terms of character development, again, Duolingo has done just as good, about as good of a job as you can get of like, you know, for just a language learning app. You know, there are people out there who will immediately know the green owl we're talking about, and Lily, and like the different characters in the Duolingo universe, almost like they're like Disney or Nintendo characters, except this is a language learning mobile app So I think they've done an incredible job with that. And so the next question I want to ask you though was basically what does the conversion of free users to the paid tier look like right now? Because that seems like really the key question to me for how the business is doing, and something we'd want to watch going forward.
Currently, about 9% of the monthly active users are paid subscribers, which is an absolute number, something like 11.5 million people. And while growth is naturally slowing down, paid subscriber growth is still over 30% a year, which is, a phenomenally strong number. However, there's something interesting in the data. I mean, Duolingo typically shows paid subscribers relative to, again, monthly active users. So if paid subscribers are growing faster than monthly active users, paid penetration will expand. And that's what we have seen in the last 3 years when the paid subscriber conversion rate climbed from 7% to 9%. The more important metric than monthly active users, though, is daily active users, as we said already. And daily active users has been outgrowing paid subscribers. So if we use daily active users instead of monthly actives as the denominator for calculating paid conversion, the trend is actually declining. And that isn't necessarily alarming because there's often a time lag between someone becoming a daily active user and then deciding to actually upgrade to a paid tier, especially when user growth reaccelerates, which has been the case in 2022 and 2023. And basically, you have then flooding new cohorts with basically new members, right? And I still think it's an important metric to monitor because in theory, as daily active user growth normalizes and cohorts mature, paid subscriber growth should reaccelerate relative to daily actives. And if not, that could mean that, either churn rates go up or conversion is worse with the newer cohorts. As you know, my co-host Shawn and I are obsessed with analyzing companies. But you probably have noticed from personal experience that talking stocks is not everyone's favorite hobby. And I'm reminded of that every time I bring up investing at dinner or when I'm out with friends. They tolerate it for about 10 minutes, but then I get this look. The one that says, we get it, you love stocks, but this is not the place. So Shawn and I thought, why not build that place? And we did it. It's called the Intrinsic Value Community. Our members range from pilots and firefighters to lawyers and engineers, but also hedge fund managers, actual rocket scientists, and CEOs. And despite those different backgrounds, what connects all of us is the passion for value investing and continuous learning. And each week, we host live calls, covering everything from vetting the group's best stock pitches to analyzing portfolios, investing case studies, and conversations with expert guest speakers who are either prominent portfolio managers, CEOs, or authors. And the best thing is that if you ever miss a call, we have a library of recordings for watching back every single call we've ever hosted. And if you prefer reading over watching, well, then we have dedicated spaces in the community to share write-ups, discuss investing ideas, or just your thoughts on the general market. And multiple times a year, we bring the community from the virtual world into the real one, including private dinners in Omaha for Berkshire Weekend and meetups in New York City to explore, hang out, and most importantly, talk stocks. Our last cohort of members brought together 20 incredibly thoughtful people, some of the sharpest investors that Shawn and I have ever met. And if you want the chance to learn alongside people like that, you should join our waitlist at theinvestorspodcast.com/intrinsic value community. That's theinvestorspodcast.com/intrinsic value community.
Naturally, increasing that conversion rate is the company's primary fixation because it's the best way to not only increase revenue and profits, right? It's the most direct way to do that. But also, when they make those conversions, they're also really materially improving the quality of their business or the quality of their earnings, which is kind of a fuzzy concept. But basically, the idea is that ads are decent business, but recurring subscription revenues are much, much more reliable and therefore higher quality. And especially for an app, it's just much more valuable to have people paying you every month where there's a degree of predictability as opposed to kind of the cyclical whims of the advertising market.
Yes, in the long run, that's definitely the way Duolingo wants to monetize the platform. And Duolingo also earns money through ads, as you just mentioned, but also an official English test. But even combined, that's less than 20% of revenue. So it's really about getting people into the paid subscription tiers. And the CEO, Louise von Ahn, does not get tired of mentioning, though, that at least right now, at the current state, they run hundreds of different A/B tests to find out what best works for the app, both in terms of improving conversion, but also just to increase daily active users. And The rationale behind that is, that there's this massive opportunity that Luis sees for Duolingo in the age of AI. He seems confident that Duolingo will at some day have 1 billion users, and converting more members to the paid tier and growing daily active users are two goals that are somewhat at odds with each other. If you, for example, include more ads or limit the number of lessons that you can do without paying, you will obviously see an increase in the conversion rate to the paid tiers because some users will finally decide to upgrade. But you will also see a decrease in daily active users because some will get annoyed by the changes, by getting more ads after each lesson, and then say, you know what, I'm out. I'm not using Duolingo anymore.
To anyone who's used Duolingo, I don't think it's a surprise to hear about those A/B tests. I mean, the app is just so almost perfectly optimized to maximize the dopamine hit that you get every time you use it, which is why we say it feels like a game where you don't always realize that you're learning a language, at least, supposedly learning a language. And to some extent, I think it reminds me of how Robinhood kind of operates. And if you compare Robinhood to traditional stockbrokers like Charles Schwab or Fidelity, I mean, gosh, you'll notice how the entire app is just programmed completely differently to keep you engaged and to trigger these emotional reactions that drive you to invest, which is very much not how Schwab. Schwab is like very boring and kind of, sophisticated and has an air of, I guess, like I said, just sophistication to it that doesn't lend itself to the degeneracy that I think Robinhood is not afraid to indulge in. And so with Duolingo, again, like I said, more than anything, it just feels like you're playing a game.
Well, it's fair to say that Duolingo is a game with learning capabilities instead of the other way around. I mean, the A/B tests they run basically can range from everything like simply changing the colors of icons or buttons to more significant structural changes such as replacing the tree-style home screen with a linear path to better guide learners. And one of the big changes I've noticed since I last used the app is that you no longer lose hearts when you make a mistake, which is also what you alluded to in the beginning. Back when I used the app, in the free tier, you had 5 hearts, and when they were gone, you couldn't do another lesson. Today, Duolingo has what they call energy bars. So as a free user, you have 25 of those. And after each question, one will disappear. So at first glance, you can do 25 questions a day. However, when you get, a streak of correct questions, you can also get energy back as well. And at first, I think that sounds like a pretty good idea because instead of punishing you for getting something wrong, which is, the case when you lose a heart, when you make a mistake, you're now getting something. You're basically getting rewarded for correct answers, which is usually a much better way to learn anything. However, there has been significant pushback because it turned out that in practice, energy goes out much quicker than hearts did. With the old system, you could, in theory, make as many lessons as you want as long as you don't make any mistakes, and this is no longer the case. Turns out, 3 lessons are about as much as you can get out of the energy bars, not depending on whether you are good and you don't make any mistakes or whether you're very bad and make a ton of mistakes. And this is a pretty good example of, once again, the balance you got to strike between higher conversions to the paid tier and more active users. And if energy is used up more quickly than hearts, obviously that improves the conversion to the paid tier. However, it will also reduce the number of daily active users.
So when the CEO says that he now has shifted the focus from increasing paid conversion rates to growing daily active users, he tends to make decisions based on what increases retention times on the app for free users instead of trying to push the premium tier at all costs. And so my question for you is that an immediate response to the backlash regarding this change in the energy bar, or did you see an impact in the number of daily active users basically after this change?
Not really. I mean, Duolingo actually saw better retention numbers, at least if you believe the CEO on the earnings call. I would speculate that this change benefited less serious learners since, they would make more mistakes with the old system and thus they would lose hearts more quickly, whereas more serious users, who are not paid subscribers though, dislike the change because they could complete more lessons using the heart system. And obviously, the more engaged users will also be the first to start rebelling against those changes. And I think generally Duolingo is very data-driven. Otherwise, you wouldn't conduct 750 A/B tests a quarter. So they conduct all these tests, and then they check not only for what is better at driving conversion or user growth, but also for figuring out which smaller metrics have the best predictive values in terms of driving these numbers, like daily actives or paid conversion. And one metric that Louise emphasized recently was the average number of words spoken per max subscriber, which is kind of a long way to describe it. And basically, it's a metric that they were able to double in 2025, in part because of the new AI tools like talking to Lily, for example. And he likes to point out that Duolingo generally, as a company, is very good at optimizing metrics once they decide to focus on them. I'm not doubting that for a second, honestly, but I do think as investors, we also need to be careful not to lose sight of the bigger picture because there are a lot of metrics that technically make a lot of sense to focus on. But the question is, do they really drive the bigger picture? And, I'm just pointing this out because I've seen so many cases in the past where management talked about a lot of secondary metrics and how great they were doing every single time. Overall, though, the fundamentals, they didn't do that great. And again, this is not what you're seeing with Duolingo right now. But after looking at over 60 companies on this show, I'm getting increasingly sensitive to this. And I could imagine the same is true for you.
It's something that famously happened a lot during the dot-com bubble. Like pets.com would say, well, hey, we don't have any revenue, but look, our web-based traffic increased 30%. And that's a great sign. And eventually that does wear out, right? But for a time, these techie growth companies have definitely been able to keep investors excited about the future with these secondary, non-traditional, non-monetary kind of metrics. And you also just can't hide reality forever, though. And actually, Match Group has had the opposite problem in a way. Their financials look pretty good, or at least like the earnings per share has been growing, but their number of paid subscribers from year to year just keeps declining and declining. And of course, you can only sustain financial growth with higher prices for a smaller and smaller user base for so long, which is really effectively what they're doing. And just pivoting a little bit here away from Match Group and back to Duolingo, something else we talked about briefly in one of our last meetings is whether people in different countries learn languages differently. It's kind of a funny point, but I do think it's remarkable how, for example, social media mostly works the same across the world despite cultural differences, right? I mean, there's some local trends that occur, but if Instagram and TikTok and Netflix have shown us anything, it's that the same type of content, more or less, does work around the world. And if anything, the difference is usually along generational lines rather than, between countries and cultures of what people like and are interested in and how they behave on these platforms. And so I think you mentioned that the CEO, Luis, pointed out that it's similar for learning languages online. And, this idea of the gamification and a streak that you want to maintain, that works in every country, no matter where you do it, right? That it's getting to, very fundamental human impulses that supersede culture. And so you might use some different sentences as examples, but otherwise there's just really no material differences in how this is implemented.
That's exactly what the CEO says. I mean, the only difference, again, is between generations. You simply get slower when you get older, but this is something that the Duolingo course more or less adjusts for anyway. And there was another interesting data point, though, that just came to my mind now as we've spoken about metrics and their impact. As you mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Duolingo is famous for posting quite unhinged content on social media, and those ads are almost always about Duolingo's owl mascot or some other of the more popular characters, for example, like Lily. The strategy is generally centered on turning this normally friendly-looking owl into a passive-aggressive, chaotic character that threatens you when you don't do your lesson. And in early 2025, Duolingo launched a dramatic multi-week campaign announcing the death of their mascot, including holding fake funerals, investigating the cause of death, and basically changing app icons to show the owl with dead eyes. And in Q3, Duolingo then decided to stop posting this sort of unhinged content in an attempt to make, the brand a bit more grown up, a bit more serious. And according to CEO Luis Van, the original idea came from the Duolingo community itself. However, the content shift toward, talking more about Duolingo's mission resulted in significantly fewer views, which was expected, but it also resulted in an immediately visible slowdown in user growth. Honestly, I don't know what I should think about that. Sure, if you have highly efficient marketing strategies, that's fantastic. But if the impact of posting fewer unhinged ads is so severe that you stop the plans of kind of rebranding the company, then I don't shake the feeling that this might point to a weakness of the business. And I'm thinking about this in terms of, the target audience. There are two different ways to see this, obviously. And they basically decide whether you like the investment case of Duolingo or not. These unhinged ads are generally funny, but I think they primarily target people who sit at home on a Tuesday night and think to themselves, you know what, I should learn Spanish. I would also not be surprised at all if, the gamification aspect works even better with exactly that audience too. And when you think about the monetization potential though, you generally want people seriously interested in learning.
So I think you're saying that if Duolingo's marketing engine only works when they post funny memes and unhinged content, but not when they post things about their actual mission and use case, it probably indicates that people don't take the app very seriously, which I think is fair, and that those same people were likely never really interested in paying for a service like this in the first place, or at least they're probably not all that loyal to the brand, and then they're more likely to switch over, which is, of course, going to be a big problem for Duolingo.
That's the one side or the one way you can think about it. However, I think there's another side to it as well. When, Luis came up with the idea for Duolingo, he and his co-founder were both in the process of learning a language. And they basically had a challenge where they both had a daily 30-minute lesson. And after some time, they figured out, well, they often skip those. And I get that. When I was still in college, I set a challenge to spend a month or two on something new, and I wanted to learn that. Essentially, I chose a topic, I set a goal, created my own study plan, and then I started. Then after 4 to 8 weeks, when I hopefully reached my goal, I would switch to another topic. Actually, chess was one of those projects with limited success. And I had to create those little habits and routines to actually stick with it, because even spending, let's say, half an hour a day concentrated on something that's not work or your primary goal can be extremely difficult. I mean, it's basically your free time and you can spend it, with something that's fun. And the point is, just because Duolingo seems like more of a game than actual studying doesn't necessarily mean it's not attracting people who actually want to learn something or, a language. And it's not like people who are serious about learning a language don't want to be entertained while they do it. So generally, I think that gamifying is just an incredibly powerful tool, and Duolingo's success using it kind of speaks for itself. And just because, it's a bit more fun than other apps doesn't mean that, people who seriously want to learn a language don't go to Duolingo and pay for it.
Well, how about we get to the elephant in the room, which is the massive 80% drawdown in the stock that it's gone through in the last 10 months. And I think that's one of the more severe drawdowns we've seen here on this show. And the first company that comes to mind that we've talked about already is being in a similar situation as Match Group. And that was fueled, though, by actual declines in their user base, as I was mentioning. So what happened for Duolingo? Has growth just been slower than Wall Street expected? Is it AI or just, valuation repricing of SaaS companies everywhere? Or, when you think about what ChatGPT did to Chegg, I'm sure that made many Duolingo investors nervous. So, I mean, how much does that factor in? And I mean, yeah, what is driving this 80% sell-off, Daniel?
I would say it's all of the above, except for a slowdown in growth, which we have not seen. But, honestly, I would also not have looked at Duolingo if we didn't see a sell-off of 80%. I mean, when the stock was at an all-time high in May last year, it traded at a price-to-sales ratio of 30 times. Now it's trading at a price-to-sales ratio below 6. So even on an EV to free cash flow level, the company came down from ridiculous levels of over 80 times to a moderate 12 times. So that's an incredibly low multiple for a company growing 30 to 40% a year. However, if you adjust free cash flow for stock-based comp, which is quite high for Duolingo, you get a more realistic EV to adjusted free cash flow of 20 times. Still though, for a company growing at these rates, that's very cheap. And the big question is whether Duolingo can sustainably grow at these rates and then also keep churn low. If that's the case, I think you have a pretty good deal here.
So the stock used to be massively overvalued, but now we're looking at what is a fast-growing company, definitely trading at a more reasonable price. And then honestly, you might even make the case that it's cheaply priced compared to its recent growth if you just even extrapolate a fraction of that growth going forward. And so I assume the market then is really just pricing the risk that AI will disrupt the business, kind of like with Chegg, which seems to be so often the case with the companies we look at, especially Adobe comes to mind, where it just feels like the market has completely soured on some businesses we love because of the uncertainty of what the implications from AI are going to be. And I remember last time I traveled internationally, it was to Portugal with you, actually, and I didn't feel like I needed to try and even learn Portuguese. And I think my wife was all excited about it, and she downloaded Duolingo. but Google Translate is just so freaking good now. It feels like I could lean on that if I ever had to, right? Most people are probably going to speak English anyways, at least in Western Europe. And then if you actually are in a situation where somebody really can't speak the language, you can lean on Google Translate. So personally, that's probably made me less and less inclined on the margins to get really excited about learning a language like German. This is my excuse. I'm rationalizing where, Germany is a country where a very large percentage of the population already speaks English. So I don't know. It's I find that hard for me to get motivated. But maybe there's some obscure languages on Duolingo. Maybe I need to learn Navajo. Maybe that'll get me more excited.
Well, I don't know about that, but yeah, you're right. I mean, the market believes that LLMs or just AI native apps will be able to either do what Duolingo is doing today and perhaps much better and much cheaper. And also, there's the argument that you say, well, learning languages has just become less valuable of a skill in today's world.
Well, and so how do you think about that? I mean, I think the answer is going to depend on whether you believe the business has any kind of moat, but still.
Well, I would say there are three modes, or maybe not yet modes, but more so competitive advantages that are worth mentioning if we talk about Duolingo. And the first would be brand. I mean, at this point, Duolingo is the first thing that pops into your head when you think about language learning. And that's the case in most countries on earth, whether you are in the US, in any country in Europe, or even other parts of the world. And I remember back when I lived in my student home in Frankfurt, how many people there used Duolingo to learn and improve their German. And those were people from 24 different countries, and pretty much all of them use Duolingo. And a big part of that brand building process has been Duolingo's phenomenal social media work, as we already alluded to. But the fact that so many people stay is simply that the app works well, at least when you look at the daily active users and the trend that it shows. I totally get that many people on the app never actually end up learning a language, but I would like to point out, as we have done today, is that most people I know and that most people that you know are probably not the best examples of serious language learners. And we do it as a hobby. I mean, if you want to improve your German, again, so that at some point we can have a talk in German, so I still hope that you use Duolingo, it's a hobby for you. And most people that I know, me included, use it for a third or a fourth language, not to learn English, because we need it for a job or something else that's really important. And the point there is that whether you really learn a language using Duolingo or not, in the end, it still comes down to your motivation. The app is highly effective in making people log in every single day and keeping them engaged, even if it's just a couple of minutes per day. And that's already 80% of what's required to actually learn language, if you ask me. And beyond that, there is simply the factor of whether you're truly motivated to learn something, and if not, even the best language app in the world won't make you succeed.
I don't think I know anyone who's become fluent with a language primarily using Duolingo. But like you said, I'm sure it has a lot to do with my social circle. I don't know many people whose professional lives really depend on them learning a language. And actually, the valedictorian of my high school works at Duolingo, so I'm sure she can vouch for it. And gosh, I mean, she was someone who could have gone anywhere to work. So the fact that she went to Duolingo has actually kind of stuck in the back of my head for years now. And I think she still works there. And it's like one of those stupid anecdotes that I'm not like proudly saying biases me, but it does make me think subconsciously, hey, this must kind of be a special company, or at least a special company to work for, to be able to attract that kind of top talent. I mean, clearly other people see real value in the mission that they're working on.
It's actually interesting you say that, because Louis von Ahn got quite a big shitstorm when he once put out a memo that Duolingo is a quote-unquote AI-first company. And in part, that's because both users and employees see Duolingo more as a mission-driven company than one driven by profitability and growth. And Louis even once said that he had to change the culture a bit within the company because it seemed like too many employees didn't fully understand that a company also needs to make money. And perhaps, the valedictorian of your school joined because she believed in the mission too. But getting back to the second potential mode for Duolingo, that's data. Duolingo is the most used language app in the world. Again, 50 million daily active users generate a ton of data for Duolingo, which can then be used to feed its AI tools. And every exercise produces labels like correct or incorrect, time taken to answer, hints used, numbers of attempts, and also the type of error that you did. And all of those data points are why Duolingo can train its AI models so efficiently. And the weakness is that Duolingo has no obvious network effect. Of course, you could, start a challenge with a friend where you both start to study a language, but it's just way less direct than, on apps like TikTok or Instagram, where you directly benefit from other people being on the platform, either by sending, memes to your friends or also just by other people posting the content. And I talked to one of our members in the intrinsic value community who is quite bullish on Duolingo, and he actually compared Duolingo to Spotify in terms of how far ahead it is compared to its competitors. And I partly agree. You could argue that Duolingo's network effect is the data, for example. The more people learn, the more Duolingo can use the data to then improve the learning experience for you. Think about the advantages of the international learner base that you have. Duolingo can not only personalize lessons for you, but it also knows that, let's say, German speakers struggle with a certain word or structure in English, and it can then include that learning basically in the lesson for all German Duolingo users. And in that aspect, Duolingo is similar to what Spotify can do with its data. However, Spotify has a flywheel that spins since users and artists reinforce each other. So the more users Spotify has, the more artists want to join the platform, and the more artists Spotify has, the more users want to join the platform. And that's a dynamic that you simply don't have with Duolingo.
I was just thinking about this the other day with Spotify because I think I turned it off, or maybe just Spotify got rid of it. But I used to discover music almost exclusively by being able to see what my friends were listening to in real time. I thought that was like the coolest thing ever, maybe like a decade ago. And that's not the strongest network effect ever. And Spotify has a much more legitimate network effect that you were just describing, but it was pretty effective with me. And even this, I think, is stronger than Duolingo's friends network that they try to promote on the app. I mean, it's just never really resonated with me. Like, you could see that a friend was learning a language, and I think you can like virtually high five each other and support each other. And it's all very nice. And it's like, okay, that was really only one time information though, right? Like, okay, Daniel's learning Spanish. Got it. I don't really need to see continuous updates the way I might be interested in kind of continuously saying, oh, look at what Daniel's listening to. That's interesting. Let me listen to that song. Because they're probably going to stay learning the same language. So it just doesn't make sense in the same way. And I think what can be easily missed is the fact that Duolingo's main focus is on keeping people engaged and sort of changing their behavior. Uber and Airbnb changed people's behaviors, for example. And so the market for ride sharing and house sharing used to be much, much smaller, but they convinced people to change their habits, and that unlocked hundreds of billions of dollars in value. And that is what Duolingo is pretty good at. If you tried learning a language with the help of any LLM, you will know that it's a complete nightmare. And so there's no way that you're going to stick with learning a language through ChatGPT. And it's similar for most AI native apps, I think, too. The hard part is getting users to log in every day for a long time and matching the lessons to their current level of skill. And the fact that Duolingo does run so many A/B tests and has so much user data and has been doing this for so many years, I mean, there is some sort of real advantage with it that they can optimize the experience, even despite my frustrations with it, in a really good way. And, for the most part, it is a really good experience.
I don't know what call it was, but some time ago on one of our community calls, you kind of said to yourself, don't overthink it, dummy. Sometimes it is just that easy. And I think we tend to get into the weeds of the companies that we look at, and especially when we follow them for a while because they are in our portfolio. And then you end up, talking about all kinds of possible bear scenarios. But when you own a great company, the best you can do is sit on it and not overthink every piece of news. I don't think Duolingo fits the category of a great company yet. So I don't want to make an argument for buying Duolingo by saying that. But when I think about the AI risk, you might do well if you don't overcomplicate things. Since ChatGPT was introduced, Duolingo has grown its daily active users from 15 million to 50 million. Revenue went from $250 million to almost $1 billion, and operating margins went from negative 2.5% to positive 11%. The point being, Duolingo has nothing but benefited from AI yet. And of course, this can change in the future, but that's true for 80% of the companies we look at on this show.
Well, I think that's right. And to your earlier point, I mean, I go back and forth on this idea of don't overthink things, dummy. Because you look around, you think, just stop thinking so much. In a decade from now, you're probably going to be glad that you bought Alphabet or Uber or Netflix or whatever it is. And then there's this other part of me that feels like, Man, we're going through such a truly extraordinary period of accelerated technological progress. And that can humble any of the assumptions that you take for granted. And I don't know, before I get lost on an AI tangent, how about you talked about this problem with the monetization of users studying English outside of the US or Europe. And I think that's a recurring theme. We see that with Netflix, we see that with Spotify, which is to some extent users outside of their core developed markets tend to generate much less revenue per user. And so really how you square that is going to be interesting for Duolingo. So maybe you can speak more to that challenge for them.
So, in one of the latest earnings calls, Luis talked about how difficult it can be to monetize users outside of the US or Europe. So, let's say South America, for example. He said something that reminded me a lot about the difference between the idea of paying for convenience that we also talked about when we covered Mercado Libre here on the show. One of its biggest competitors was Shopee, a Southeast Asian company. And Shopee can compete with Mercado Libre despite longer wait times because South American users they're willing to forego some convenience if that means they can pay less money. And for an American or an European, waiting a week or two for a package is by now unimaginable. If they can pay $4 extra to have it arrive the next day, most of them will do it. We all know that a subscription like Amazon Prime is even more effective than paying for shipping extra, but the point remains. People are generally more willing to pay for convenience, while in many South American countries, people would rather wait a week than pay extra dollars for it to arrive early. And it is the same thing for Duolingo. Luis actually mentioned that as long as you can use the app for free, people do that, even the power users. So they prefer watching ads and being limited in how much they can study to paying for Super or Max, even, and that's what he said, if it would be at a price point of just 50 cents.
To some extent, I mean, it just makes you wonder whether Duolingo is doomed to ultimately have most of its engaged users in countries where really people just refuse to pay at all because that's where the service is most valuable. And then that would mean that you primarily make money via ads, or you just have to accept much lower ARPUs, which would actually suggest that the quality of the business could decline going forward as adoption scales. And to me, that's besides disruption from AI. I think that's really the big concern that I have with the business.
I'm pretty sure we will still get into the AI risks in more detail, but I do think this right here is also one of the bigger potential bear cases. I mean, if Duolingo's popularity in the US or in Europe declines, it could still be a company that remains highly relevant for people who seriously need to learn English, but simply operating in a less attractive market. And actually, most users are already sitting outside the US, so while about 50% of revenue comes from the US, only 20% of daily active users are. So that basically means that 20% of users are responsible for 50% of revenue. And you might speculate that these customers are also less sticky since most US users will be learning a second language as a hobby and not because they need it for their job. And again, it could very well be that Duolingo won't be successful monetizing users outside the US or Europe at all, or at significantly lower ARPUs.
Maybe this is a good time to talk about the other big bear cases that are lurking here, and I think are mostly AI related. And so one of the bear arguments I've repeatedly heard is that learning languages will become less important. And this is kind of what I was saying earlier about my trip to Portugal, where I felt less inclined to feel like I needed to learn much of the language before I went, as AI translation or real-time translation has become more widespread. And I think on that point, you could really imagine the international business world changing pretty significantly when you have real-time translation integrated into Zoom or Google. And so, yeah, how do you think about that?
I think you mentioned some of the most important points, but I would only partly agree. I think in the end, the whole AI translation debate pretty much underestimates the power of human interaction, also the complexity of communication. There are so many nuances, not just in language, but also in tone, pronunciation, facial expression. All of that is part of a conversation, and most of that is best communicated and transported when both speak the same language. I think I would even argue that communication works better when someone is not perfectly fluent in the language spoken than when they can't speak it at all and instead rely on translation services. I can't imagine how For example, the two of us would sit in our almost daily meetings, and I speak German and you speak English, and then we have AI translate everything. Even just, the couple of seconds it would take me to either read or listen to the translation, just the facial expressions you miss, the accentuation you would miss, it's just not the same at all. And beyond that, and that's, a point maybe a native English speaker might not appreciate to the same extent, there is something special about, someone talking to you in your language when you know it's not their native language. It shows some form of respect, commitment, maybe even confidence. And perhaps I'm losing myself on a tangent here, but I think communication and language are just a totally underrated topic. I mean, the two of us had a meeting with Stig, TIP's CEO and co-founder, not too long ago, and he talked about how different people can see the world. So, for example, if you're an engineer, you might have listened to my tangent on the importance of communication in the last minute or two and thought it was ridiculous because as long as your translation service works, it's a much more efficient way than actually learning a new language. And you would be right. But, with humans, not everything is 100% logical. And how we communicate is probably one of those fields where logic takes the backseat from time to time. I mean, I know that, for example, when I was in Montana, we had one or two members who actually made an effort to pronounce my name the correct way. And, that just shows some form of respect. And maybe even, if someone texts me on LinkedIn and they say, well, actually, I can speak a bit of German, and they text me in German, that's a pretty good way to make sure that I actually respond because it's just, a form of appreciation that you otherwise wouldn't get.
I'll have to start greeting you in German before we record, Daniel. But no, I'm kidding. I mean, there's definitely truth to that. And if you ask me whether I'm confident enough, though, to bet a portion of my portfolio on people continuing to invest hundreds of hours into learning languages themselves, we have nearly perfect real-time translation tools that become, increasingly available. That's where I'm not so sure. I think it's a really nice, like, feel-good story, but a lot of work goes into, I don't have to tell you, to learning a language, right? And, I wonder if more and more people will find that the calculus is less worthwhile when it's not just, Netflix and TikTok distracting you, but you also know that you have these apps that are really, really is seamless. But yeah, in a similar vein, I guess I want to ask you how you think about the risk that AI translation apps could create competitive apps that can basically quickly reach Duolingo's level. And one thing I might say before you answer is I think this gets to the heart of a question I've been thinking about a lot lately, and that's how LLMs are only trained on the outcomes of things. And so, what do I mean by that? Well, they can see at a distance how Meta's algorithm works from maybe a user perspective, but the actual details behind the algos are closely guarded internal information that the LLMs haven't been trained on. So an LLM may give the illusion of being able to exactly understand certain things, like how the Meta algorithm works, but in reality, they're only seeing the output and not the input. And so, for example, maybe to make things more tangible, you could connect your Instagram to ChatGPT, and it can learn a lot about you by going through your account, looking from the outside in. But compare that with the amount of data that Meta has about you, right? They've got all the metadata on your posts, where you've been, what time of day you post that, what time of day you log in. They can see everything you've ever liked on the platform, all the posts you scrolled past, how long you lingered on those posts, everything your friends liked, what your friends of friends are doing and who they are. And I mean, that's just like the bare minimum, scratching the surface of what they know about you. And again, ChatGPT doesn't have that. I mean, they can look at your output. They can see, Shawn and Daniel posted a picture together in Montana, and they can get some info and context, but it's nothing like what the underlying platform has going on behind the scenes. And that's guarded, gated information, right? That LLMs, right? They've been trained on the open internet, but it's not like they have been trained on the internal processes of all of these companies. And so that leads into this discussion of, the barriers to producing software have fallen significantly with these advances in AI coding. And, maybe AI can create a language app nearly as good as Duolingo. Yet, is it really possible to do that without access to the same underlying data that I'm sure Duolingo is not making available to the ChatGPTs of the world, or people building apps with ChatGPT? The reality is that data is very valuable, and they're really the only ones with it. And what are the implications of that for the durability of their competitive moat?
if you want to argue that Duolingo has a moat, most likely you would need to go into the data direction. And I guess this is one of the key questions regarding AI. And, how much difference will it make that AI can only be trained through outputs? That ultimately also answers, the question whether all the A/B testing and the data that Duolingo has will turn into a moat or nothing else than, let's say, a bunch of data that is not the difference maker when it comes to actually building a competitive tool. And Duolingo is no Meta. The ecosystem that Meta has produces a magnitude of valuable data more than Duolingo ever could. And if I had to bet, I would say Duolingo's data advantage wouldn't be enough to prevent it from, a competitor building a similar app with AI. And switching costs and network effects are rather low too, but if anything, probably the scale that Duolingo has already reached, plus the brand, is why I would say it's likely to succeed. The data mode alone, probably not.
I guess I'm just feeling a little bearish today, but before we look at the bull case, I just want to ask you if there's any other aspects of the bear case that you think we should consider that maybe we haven't talked about yet.
I think we covered most of them. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to whether you believe the company has something that cannot be copied or that makes it stand out among other language, study, or even gaming apps. I mean, maybe you remember how I mentioned in my Meta episode how much time I spent going through Meta ads before my pitch. And besides watches, I also saw an ad for an app that is supposed to improve your accent. And that's not the same as a language learning app, but I gotta say, not only is the app pretty good and mostly AI based, but it also showed me how competitive that space is and how quickly you can get hooked on another app. On that point, it would be interesting to get more data on how exactly people are using Duolingo, as in how much time do daily active users spend on the app. We all know how effective streaks are for getting people active every single day on the app. However, when I think back to my Duolingo use, and it looks like yours has been the same, at least the last 3 months of using it, I was just keeping my streak alive by quickly finishing a lesson, and that made me count into the daily active user statistic. However, I wasn't using the app for longer than 2 or 3 minutes, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case for a whole lot of people, and those people are unlikely to convert to a paid subscription, and if they're already on a paid subscription, it's likely they will churn eventually, except for this effect, which you basically talked about, that you could see it as somewhat of a gym membership. You pay for it because it feels good, but is that a business model I want to bet on? Likely not.
Yeah, I mean, we saw that with Snapchat, which faces a similar problem. And when I pitched that company here on the show, I realized how unprofitable, kind of counterintuitively, having a huge number of daily active users can be if they're not actually spending a lot of time on the app, or it's very difficult to monetize them, right? Because the more people that use your service, if you're not actually profiting from them appropriately, then you're just outlaying more and more computing power to make the service usable for them. And basically you're in almost like a death spiral of declining margins and profitability. And yeah, we often talk about businesses where the subscription service feels like a no-brainer, and perhaps Amazon Prime is my favorite example to bring up of that. And the value you get is so much more than you pay for, that it makes sense to anyone signing up that it pays for itself. And so oftentimes businesses that can create these no-brainer kind of subscriptions, maybe think Costco too, they are benefiting from having some kind of larger ecosystem that they can tap into. And so Amazon, for example, they fund their subscription service to an extent with the marketplace and also with AWS. And so in turn, the subscription service brings in more users and turns them into highly loyal customers. And if you lack that ecosystem or other profitable businesses that can subsidize your scaled economy shared business, you need the subscription to be profitable. And it's more difficult than, it's almost like a competitive disadvantage if you don't have these other profitable businesses that can subsidize some of the other places that you compete in. And it just makes it harder to bundle things in a way that it becomes a no-brainer for customers. And if you think about the streaming sector, even some of the biggest media companies weren't able to create a service that people would subscribe to, or at least stay subscribed to. And clearly Netflix has been able to do that. And so, I think it's often easy to forget just how hard capitalism is and how hard it is to do what the market leader has been able to do for a period of time.
And generally, I mean, apps that have no physical footprint or assets, they just have a hard time becoming a successful business in the long run. I know there are some exceptions, but think about apps like Clubhouse, which had a $4 billion valuation at one point, which is not too far off from where Duolingo is currently. And there are dozens more of these examples. And most successful app businesses, they have a mix of, a digital and physical footprint or infrastructure. Uber, for example, has a huge network of drivers. DoorDash has signed up thousands of restaurants, and the list goes on. Duolingo doesn't really have any of that. I mean, historically, that makes an app easier to disrupt, and there's nothing to argue about that. And at the same time, Netflix was able to survive and thrive in a highly competitive industry. And while they have a lot of capex, which kind of can act as a moat or competitive advantage, I think it really wasn't one for Netflix because, I mean, they had competitors like Disney, which should have been way better positioned to win the streaming wars. And to some extent, we just don't know why Netflix succeeded. I think Netflix is just the go-to service and everything else is on the margin, or you just, sign up to Disney Plus to watch a specific show. And perhaps Duolingo can be that for language learning and other subjects that you could learn on an app too.
Well, speaking of future potential, I think we already have done a pretty good job talking about the possible upsides as well as definitely the risks or doubts that we have about the company. But I've seen so much talk about this stock as being a potential 100-bagger, as some people frame it. And gosh, I would be very curious to hear what these ultra bull theses look like for Duolingo. How are people getting to numbers where they can look at you with a straight face and say that this company might be a 100-bagger?
I think for some people out there, delusion is the only right answer. I don't know how Duolingo is supposed to be a $1 trillion company, honestly. If we talk about more realistic bull cases, it mostly comes down to the current market cap, which is again about $5 billion. And then Duolingo's competitive position and the fact that, the education TAM, total addressable market, is huge. Up until now, we mostly talked about Duolingo as an app to learn languages. But again, they are now also expanding to have courses in math, music, and chess. And chess is actually the fastest growing course ever. It's growing even faster than languages did back in the day. And one possible advantage of chess is the player versus player function. We talked about how, difficult it is for Duolingo because they do not have an obvious network effect. Well, if you compete against each other, player versus player in chess, that would change that part. You would actually benefit from more users using and playing chess on Duolingo. So I guess the bull thesis is that Duolingo will not only be the market leader in language learning, but also in all sorts of other fields. And, that's a $1 trillion market right there. And based on active users, Duolingo currently captures about 7% of all language learners, but it only captures 1% of all the money spent on language education. And, as more of that moves into the online world and Duolingo improves its monetization, you could have a market leader with, a double-digit market share in a $1 trillion industry. And at least that's how the bull case works out in my eyes. And if we take a step back, the company, again, is currently worth about $5 billion. That's after an 80% drop the stock went through. So while it would take a lot to become a 100-bagger, it's not that difficult to paint a scenario in which, the stock becomes a multi-bagger, which wouldn't be bad either, if you ask me.
No, I think we would happily take that. But I heard that one step Duolingo is taking to increase profitability right now is diverting traffic to its own website so that when a user upgrades, they don't go through the App Store, and then Duolingo can save up to 30% on the App Store fees that Google and Apple like to charge. And if that works, I think it's another argument for the brand strength of Duolingo. I'm kind of skeptical of to what extent they can actually get people to do that. But whenever there's an extra layer of complexity, it needs trust and willingness from users to go through with that. And apparently that's the case with Duolingo, where you have a percentage of users who are happy to take the extra step to go to the website to check out. And they probably don't know they're doing so to save Duolingo money, but that is pretty much why.
It's one of the more immediate measures, that Duolingo is taking to increase profitability. And it's still in the test phase. And, due to an outstanding court ruling, we don't know if this will be something that they can do in the long run. But apparently, it works quite well. I mean, Louis said that they lose some people along the way, but he made it sound like that's not a lot of people, so churn is minimal, and it's still way more profitable than going through the App Store if you lose a couple of people here, but then save 30% on an annual subscription, which costs $100 upwards.
I think we're getting pretty close to the valuation, but there's probably one more thing that we need to bring up for the sake of proper diligence here. And just recently, it was that there was this announcement that the CFO is leaving. So I would be remiss to not ask you about that. Is there anything from that announcement that caught your attention that's, worth us looking more into, or is this really just a transition that occurred without any drama?
From what I could find, I think it was the latter. Matt Skarupa posted on LinkedIn about his decision and his gratitude for being part of the journey, and he will also stay on board to ensure that the transition goes smoothly, which I think it will, since his successor has served on the board since 2019 and has prior CFO experience. So I don't think it's anything I would worry about if I would be a shareholder.
All right, well then it's time to talk valuation. And I gotta say, I was surprised to hear that Duolingo, based on metrics like enterprise value to free cash flow, EV to FCF, just sort of like a different lens to think about. It's like an alternative to the price to earnings ratio. The company seems to be priced on the cheaper end of things. And when I look at the margin profile, it does look pretty promising. Return on invested capital has looked less promising. So I wanted to ask you if there's really any reason for that, and how you think about that going forward.
Yeah, maybe first of all, I mean, for example, why do you take EV instead of price here normally? Because this is a company worth $5 billion and they have $1 billion in cash on the balance sheet and no debt. So that's why you would say, okay, well, if that's the case and you have so much debt compared to the market cap, it can make sense to use enterprise value, which takes into account debt and cash. And basically you would then end up with an enterprise value of only 4 billion instead of a market cap of 5 billion. So yeah, first of all, Duolingo has not been profitable for that long. So when you don't earn a profit, you will naturally have a negative return on invested capital. In more recent times, though, what's weighing on ROIC is the fact that Duolingo expenses the vast majority of its research and development costs immediately rather than capitalizing them as assets. So that means they're flowing through the income statement, and that is decreasing profits. And since R&D is Duolingo's largest expense, ranging from 37% to 44% in recent quarters and years, this significantly depresses the return, which is defined as net operating profits after taxes used in the ROIC calculation. If you add to that Duolingo is still primarily focused on user growth rather than monetization, and when that's the case, there's a metric you can look at for an app like Duolingo, and that's called marketing spend or sales efficiency. So you calculate sales efficiently basically by taking the difference in revenue between this year and last year and then dividing it by the marketing costs. And if you do that, you get a number which is something like 2.4 for Duolingo. And that basically means that for every dollar they spend on marketing, Duolingo earns $2.40 in revenue. And that's a very strong metric.
All right, so investments are certainly paying off, even if it isn't yet really showing up in the numbers, at least like the metrics we like to look at, ROIC, return on invested capital. So how about we actually get into your valuation model and try to get an idea of what is the fair value of the stock, and then really what is the intrinsic value in the sense of at what price would we feel comfortable buying the stock given the risk return profile looking forward?
Yeah, so first, something that I would like to say is we actually had a call with Adam Cecil in our community just the other day, and Duolingo was also a topic, only a short one though. And one thing that he said is, well, for companies like this, and I couldn't agree more, you're a business analyst, you're not a financial analyst. So looking at the numbers now from Duolingo, you have no idea where they will actually be in 5 years from now. So what you should focus on is figuring out if this is a company that actually has a moat and a competitive advantage and cannot be disrupted by other competitors or AI, no matter how it actually evolves in the next couple of years. So I think that's what we did up until now. So that's probably the most important part, even more important than the valuation right now. But having said all of that, yeah, so let me maybe quickly go into the model and explain a bit more about the accounting of Duolingo. Nothing, complex, but something that's worth mentioning. Duolingo reports something that is called bookings. Essentially, that's cash received from customers, while revenue is basically just an accounting measure that can lag behind in cash. So what do I mean by that? If you sign up for an annual Duolingo membership for, let's say, $120, Duolingo receives the full amount upfront, and that's the number that booking shows. However, revenue is recognized gradually over the next 12 months. So basically, it's $10 a month. So if you sign up in June, Duolingo will only report $70 in revenue for that year, although the entire $120 are shown in the bookings number. So with that aside, in my model, I've broken down the revenue by first looking at bookings, and then I put bookings into two buckets. So that are subscription bookings, just from, the max tier, the super family tier, and non-subscription bookings like ads or the standardized English test that Duolingo offers. Because ads and one-time purchases are recognized instantly, non-sub bookings are basically equal to the non-sub revenue. I won't go into detail about how I model subscription revenue. Just briefly, I assumed a mix of annual subscriptions and recognition rate that actually determines how much of the bookings will be recognized as revenue in any given year. So if 5 months are left, then it will be 5 months. If 7 months are left, it will be 7 months. It might sound complicated, but it's really not. And most importantly, the differences between bookings and revenues are also not that large either. So it doesn't have a material impact on the model. So long story short, with low single digit dilution, something like 2%, low 20s adjusted free cash flow margins, and an exit multiple of 21, which is about where we are today, I get a fair value of about $180 per share. But then given, the right range of outcomes with this stock, I decided to go with a margin of safety of about 30%. And that leaves us with an intrinsic value of about $130 per share right now. In a bull case, I can see free cash flow margins move even closer to EBITDA margins, basically reaching 30% in 2 or 3 years from now. And if you combine that with a revenue CAGR in the low 30s, you get a $300 stock. So even with a 30% margin of safety and a reasonable multiple of 25 times, this would be a very good investment based on today's price. And then you can just as easily, and that's pretty much the end of it, paint a bear case too. And probably both my bear and bull cases are generally too conservative, and still I get $60 estimated fair value when I assume 20% revenue growth. So still growing, quite high, but only 11% free cash flow, just simply due to lower margins. And in a bear case, it's also fair to assume that the share count will increase faster than in a bull or a bear case. So I went with 4% a year, which is quite a lot, but historically, Duolingo has had quite its fair share of dilution. So, summarizing it all, the point is, I consider this stock's future to be highly uncertain. I could, see this app become better, more popular, and also more profitable every year. But I also wouldn't be surprised if 5 years from now, the fundamentals have deteriorated significantly. And I know that's not necessarily a satisfactory answer, but, that's a game of investing. As value investors, we want to first limit losses. And, that's hard to do in this stock. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if it's significantly lower in 5 years. And still, I gotta say that too, it does seem like kind of an asymmetric opportunity at today's prices below $120 for someone with the right risk tolerance. It's definitely not what we look for in the intrinsic value portfolio, so I'm not suggesting we should add it. But for transparency, I opened a very small gambling position in my personal portfolio at an average price of $114. It's certainly money that I'm okay to lose.
Well, it's tempting, and I think it's okay to have those gambling positions, right? I mean, you only live once, and as long as you're not being irresponsible with it, which I know you're not, Daniel, that's perfectly fine to do. And I've been guilty of doing the same thing at times. But yeah, I don't know. I can only stomach so much potential AI disruption in my portfolio, and I think Duolingo seems to fall more squarely into a box where I'm just not confident about how they'll be impacted, or confident that they won't be significantly impacted to their detriment. And my very basic view is that deeply entrenched enterprise software is going to be very difficult to disrupt if that ever even happens. So that's the Salesforces and Adobes of the world, where you have real professionals and decision makers relying on these systems with their careers depending on them. And so it's just very unlikely that anytime soon people are going to trust these vibe coded AI apps to basically replace some of those operations and responsibilities. And so I think the barrier to writing software, though, is lower than ever. And so it is easier than ever to create an app. And so if I was a mobile app company right now, or B2C mobile apps, that just seems like an industry that is so much likelier to be disrupted than some of the enterprise SaaS behemoths that we've looked at on this show. Even if the market has been panicking about SaaSmageddon, to me, there's such a huge difference between a mobile app on your phone that appeals to people that are kind of almost playing a game versus this massive enterprise system that is, Salesforce and Adobe. And so anyways, that's kind of my spiel of in this world of AI disruption, not all software companies are positioned the same, and some are much more vulnerable and some are much less vulnerable. And Duolingo, in my opinion, skews much closer to the vulnerable side of things than some of the other software companies we own. And that's not me saying I'm certain that Duolingo is a bad bet. I'm not interested in shorting the company, but yeah, I don't know. It's just, it makes me a little too uneasy. And so I do hope things work out for Duolingo because come on, I mean, who could not love that little green owl? But it's a story I'm happy to watch from the sidelines. And if that very small bet pays off for you, Daniel, I'll be expecting you to buy me drinks or something next time we meet up.
I will do that, but only if you ask me in German. Because I studied on Duolingo, and that would help my investment. Okay, we take that. No, but honestly, I do think going into this deep research or valuation, I did think that Duolingo would just be more expensive than it turned out to be, but I wasn't surprised to see that even in the end, I don't consider this to be a company with a moat. If you ask me what's the most likely to happen in 5 years, I do think this company will at least, if not being disrupted, have significantly more competition. And that's never a good thing for your investments. But all right, having said all of that, how about you tell us about next week's episode? What are the hints that you can give us?
We just can't keep away from software because next week we're looking at another software business and one that has recently IPO'd and definitely skews more in the B2B platform enterprise side of things like I was just describing than the B2C model that Duolingo follows. And I'm sure that's way too vague for anyone to know what I'm talking about. So I would just add that I decided to pitch this company after wanting to better understand Adobe's competition. I think I'll leave it there.
All right, I think the last hint might have given me an idea of what company we look at. All right, so let me close it for today with a quote by Peter Lynch. He said, "Remember, things are never clear until it's too late." And, I remembered that one. I thought I would take the opportunity. And with that, I will close it for today. See you all next Sunday.
Thanks for listening to TIP. Follow the Intrinsic Value podcast on your favorite podcast app and visit theinvestorspodcast.com for show notes and educational resources. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not provide financial, investment, tax, or legal advice. The content is impersonal and does not consider your objectives, financial situation, or needs. Investing involves risk, including possible loss of principal, and past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Listeners should do their own research and consult a qualified professional before making any financial decisions. Nothing on this show is a recommendation or solicitation to buy or sell any security or other financial product. Hosts, guests, and the Investors Podcast Network may hold positions in securities discussed and may change those positions at any time without notice. References to any third-party products, services, or advertisers do not constitute endorsements, and the Investors Podcast Network is not responsible for any claims made by them. Copyright by the Investors Podcast Network. All rights reserved.
For 5 minutes, Google was unusable, and as a result, global internet usage fell by 40%. We also shouldn't forget that there are over 3 billion monthly users of the Android operating system, as Android controls about 70% of the global operating system market for mobile devices. It's not lost on me that as I research Alphabet, I've gone back and forth between Google Docs, Google Sheets, Google Drive, and Google Search, all while using Google Chrome and watching YouTube videos about the company. So that just really speaks for itself. Google is such an integrated part of my life that I had to stop and think about all the different touch points I have with Google services. There's probably some more subtle ones I'm overlooking as well.